What's up sa lahat? I'm Heading para sa brand new video, and for today, ang gonna show may WWE action figure, accessories, and weapons collection. Kaya, wag na natin patagalin to. Let's get into it! Mga Ka-Gentle Ka-WWE, it's time to show off my WWE action figure, accessories, and weapons collection. Start na po tayo. First up, we have Woken Matt Hardy boat. Yan. Kasi unahin natin yung mga maliliit na accessories. Dito natin siya ilalagay. Alright. Next up, we have Doink the Clown hair wig. Ayan. Next up, we have Goldust hair wig. Ayan. Next up, we have Mankind hairpiece. Alright. Next up, we have Zack Ryder headband. Next up, we have Bobby Lashley headband. Next up, we have Unicorn headband ng New Day. Next up, we have Bayley's headband. Next up, we have Tyson Kidd headphone. Alright. Next up, we have Bobby Lashley black na cap. Ayan. Next up, we have Nikki Bella Cap. Ayan. May spikes pa. Alright. Next up, we have ECW na cap. Ayan. Alright. Next up, we have D-Generation X na cap. Ayan. Next up, we have John Cena visor na cap. Ayan. Next up, we have John Cena chain gang na cap. Ayan. Next up, we have John Cena never give up na cap. Ayan, green. Next up, we have another John Cena. 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 Ayan. Next up, we have another John Cena na cap. Alright. Next up, we have Billy Gunn na bandana. Next up, we have another Billy Gunn na bandana, D-Generation X. Next up, we have The Undertaker bandana. Ayan, American Badass. Next up, we have another The Undertaker bandana. Ayan. Next up, we have Velveteen Dream na bandana, Dream Over. Ayan. Next up, we have Hulk Hogan na bandana. Ayan, Hulkamania. Ayan. Next up, we have Hollywood Hulk Hogan na bandana. Ayan. Right. Next up, we have Brock Lesnar na bonnet. Ayan. Next up, we have another Brock Lesnar na bonnet. Next up, we have The Big Show na bonnet. Next up, we have Christian na bonnet na may shades. Ayan. Stig. Next up, we have Triple H na D-Generation X na helmet. Alright. Next up, we have Batista na cap. Ayan. Next up, we have Macho Man Randy Savage na cap. Ayan. Parang si Palos, di ba? Yung cap na yan. Alright. Next up, we have The Miz na hat. Ayan, meron pang bandana. Alright. Next up, we have Chris Jericho na hat. Yan, Festival of Friendship na hat. Next up, we have Bray Wyatt na hat. Next up, we have another Bray Wyatt na hat. Yan. Next up, we have Papashango na hat. Ayan. Next up, we have Road Dogg. Ayan, nawaway yan, di ba? D-Generation X. Alright. Next up, we have Scotty Tuhari na hat. Yan, waway. Alright. Next up, we have JBL na hat. Next up, we have the Undertaker na hat. Ayan. Next up, we have another The Undertaker na hat. Plain black. Alright. Next up, we have The Rock na shades. Ito pa iba. Ayan. Next up, we have Scott Hall and Kevin Nash na shades yan. Tapos ito pa. Yan. Next up, we have The Miz na shades. Next up, we have Edge na shades. Next up, we have John Morrison na shades. Next up, we have Jack Specific na shades. Hindi ko alam kung kanino to, pero kahit kanino pwede to. Alright. Next up, we have another Jack Specific na shades. Yan, kay Scott Steiner. Next up, we have the Dudley Boys na shades. Yan, kay Bubba Ray and Devon. Remove natin. Yan. Next up, we have Becky Lynch goggles na shades. Next up, we have Sasha Banks, the Boss shades. Next up, we have Scotty Tuhati na shades. Next up, we have Bret the Hitman Hart na shades. Next up, we have another Bret the Hitman Hart na shades. Next up, we have another Bret the Hitman Hart na shades. Next up, we have Hollywood Hulk Hogan na shades. Next up, we have another Hulk Hogan na shades. Next up, we have The Rock na shades. Next up, we have Batista na shades. Next up, we have Zack Ryder na shades. Next up, we have John Morrison na shades. Next up, we have another John Morrison na shades. Yan, may bandana pa. Johnny. Next up, we have The Ultimate Warrior na shades mask. Shades mask. Alright. Next up, we have Jey Uso bandana necklace. Next up, we have TJP CWC medal. Next up, we have Kurt Angle Olympic gold medal. Next up, we have another Kurt Angle Olympic gold medal. Next up, we have Papashango necklace. Next up, we have John Cena dog tags necklace. Next up, we have another John Cena Word Life necklace. Next up, we have another John Cena Chain Gang na necklace. Next up, we have Sheamus na necklace. Next up, we have Macho Man Randy Savage na chain necklace. Next up, we have Hollywood Hulk Hogan na gold necklace. Next up, we have Enzo Amore na necklace. Next up, we have Razor Ramon na necklace. Next up, we have Stone Cold Steve Austin na chain gold necklace. Alright. Next up, we have Adam Cole Undisputed Era armband. Next up, we have John Cena armband. Next up, we have another John Cena armband. Next up, we have another John Cena armband. Next up, we have another John Cena armband. Next up, we have Alexa Bliss hand accessory. Next up, we have Sasha Banks Legit Boss knuckles. Next up, we have John Cena World Life knuckles. Next up, we have Rey Mysterio Mask. Next up, we have another Rey Mysterio Mask. Next up, we have Kane Mask. Next up, we have another Kane Mask. Next up, we have another Kane Mask. Next up, we have Big Van Vader Mask. Next up, we have Mankind Mask. Next up, we have Mick Foley, Mr. Sacco. Next up, we have Finn Balor accessories. Next up, we have Samoa Joe towel. Next up, we have Mr. Perfect towel cloth. Next up, we have Alberto Del Rio Scarf. Next up, we have another Alberto Del Rio Scarf. Next up, we have Y2J Chris Jericho Scarf. Next up, we have Elias Scarf. Next up, we have Velveteen Dream Fur Scarf. Next up, we have Hollywood Hulk Hogan Scarf. Next up, we have another Hollywood Hulk Hogan Scarf. Next up, we have Natalia Shoulder Accessory. Next up, we have Alexa Bliss Belt Accessory. Next up, we have Hulk Hogan Weight Belt. Next up, we have another Hollywood Hulk Hogan Weight Belt. Next up, we have another Hollywood Hulk Hogan Weight Belt. Next up, we have Bret the Hitman Hart Stomach Shield Accessory. Next up, we have Stone Cold Steve Austin Knee Brace. Next up, we have the Boogeyman's Clock. Next up, we have the Usos Jimmy and Jay minifigure. Next up, we have the Undertaker's urn. Next up, we have Slammy Awards. Next up, we have Festival of Friendship Awards. Next up, we have Andre the Giant Memorial Trophy. Next up, we have Office Briefcase. Open natin. Yan. Next up, we have Silver Money in the Bank Briefcase. Next up, we have Randy Orton's Money in the Bank Briefcase. Next up, we have Damien Sandow Money in the Bank Briefcase. Next up, we have another Damien Sandow Money in the Bank Briefcase. Next up, we have Seth Rollins Money in the Bank Briefcase. Next up, we have Women's Money in the Bank Briefcase. Next up, we have Eddie Guerrero's Roses. Next up, we have the list of KO. Next up, we have the list of Jericho. Next up, we have Batista WrestleMania 21 contract. Yan. Alright. Next up, we have Triple H water bottles. Next up, we have cooler. Next up, we have spray paints. Next up, we have WWE scratch logo microphone. Next up, we have ECW microphone. Next up, we have NXT microphone. Next up, we have WWE new logo. Next up, we have Enzo Amore mic. Next up, we have commentator's microphone. Next up, we have Mattel ring bell. Next up, we have Jack Specific ring bell. Next up, we have cell phone. Next up, we have laptop. Next up, we have PlayStation 1. Next up, we have Razer. Next up, we have hand cam. Next up, we have Woken Matt Hardy's drone. Next up, we have WWF SmackDown signage. Next up, we have Y2J Chris Jericho highlight reel. Ayan. Next up, we have WWF Boom Box. Orgidate. Next up, we have speakers. Grabe, ang lalaki niyan. Alright. Next up, we have lights. Ayan. Next up, we have camera. Alright. Next up, we have stroller or travel bag. Ayan, 360 rotation. Rare na. Up lang natin. Yan. Inopen natin yung laman sa loob. Alright. Next up, we have big bag. Ayan. Alright. Next up, we have Bray Wyatt's lamp. Ayan, mga lamp ni Bray. Next up, we have Papashango accessory. Next up, we have Tyler Breeze accessory. Next up, we have Roddy Piper accessory. Next up, we have Xavier Woods The New Day accessory. Next up, we have The Game Triple H accessory D-Generation X. Next up, we have Jeff Jarrett's guitar accessory Marvel Toy Biz. Next up, we have The Rock guitar accessory. Next up, we have the Boogeyman accessory. Next up, we have Jack Swagger flag accessory. Next up, we have Petey Williams Marvel Toy Biz accessory. Next up, we have the British Bulldog accessory. Next up, we have Conor McGregor's flag. Next up, we have the Brian Kendrick's flag accessory. Next up, we have Batista referee shirt. Next up, we have HBK Shawn Michael referee shirt. Next up, we have Lita shirt. Next up, we have Kelly accessory. Next up, we have Rey Mysterio shirt. Next up, we have The Miz shirt. Next up, we have Matt Hardy version 1 shirt. Next up, we have another Matt Hardy shirt. Next up, we have Adam Cole Baby shirt. Next up, we have Jeff Hardy shirt. Next up, we have Christian shirt. Next up, we have NWO Hulk Hogan shirt. Next up, we have Eddie Guerrero I'm Your Pappy shirt. Next up, we have Baron Corbin shirt. Next up, we have Brock Lesnar Suplex City shirt. Next up, we have GTS CM Punk shirt. Next up, we have The Core Justin Gabriel shirt. Next up, we have WCW Monday Nitro shirt. Next up, we have Roddy Piper shirt. Next up, we have Sheamus shirt. Next up, we have Samoa Joe shirt. Next up, we have Randy Orton shirt. Next up, we have Evolution shirt. Next up, we have Seth Rollins shirt. Next up, we have The Club shirt. Next up, we have John Cena shirt. Next up, we have another John Cena shirt. Next up, we have another John Cena shirt. Next up, we have the Rated R Superstar Edge shirt. Next up, we have the Rockers shirt. Next up, we have Bray Wyatt Polo shirt. Next up, we have the Rock sweatshirt. Next up, we have Vince McMahon's sweatshirt. Next up, we have JBL Jacket. Next up, we have Jimmy Uso Jacket. Next up, we have Kurt Angle Jacket. Next up, we have The Rock jogging pants. Next up, we have another The Rock jogging pants. Next up, we have Brock Lesnar jogging pants. Next up, we have Kofi Kingston jogging pants. Next up, we have Daniel Bryan Wyatt jumpsuit. Next up, we have Raven's leather jacket. Next up, we have John Morrison leather coat. Look at that. Next up, we have Sting leather coat. Look at that. Next up, we have The Undertaker leather coat. Look at that. Next up, we have The Undertaker robe. Look at it. Alright. Next up, we have Ultimate Warrior coat. Look at that. Alright. Next up, we have John Morrison coat. Alright. Next up, we have Big Van Vader Cape. Look at it. Alright. Next up, we have Ken Shamrock Robe. Next up, we have Hunter Hearst Helmsley Robe. Next up, we have Bobby Roode Robe. Glorious. Next up, we have Charlotte Flair Robe. Beautiful. Next up, we have the Nature Boy Ric Flair Robe. Next up, we have another The Nature Boy Ric Flair robe. Next up, we have another The Nature Boy Ric Flair robe with a cape. Oh my. Next up, we have Woken Matt Hardy shirt Sando. Next up, we have John Cena shirt Sando. Next up, we have The Rock shirt Sando. Next up, we have The Rock shirt Sando. Next up, we have Dolph Ziggler shirt. Next up, we have NWO shirt. Next up, we have another NWO shirt. Next up, we have NWO Wolfpack shirt. Next up, we have another NWO Wolfpack shirt. Next up, we have D-Generation X shirt. Next up, we have another DX shirt. Next up, we have another DX shirt. Next up, we have Rey Mysterio shirt. Next up, we have another Rey Mysterio shirt. Next up, we have EC3 shirt. Next up, we have Cody Rhodes shirt. Next up, we have Goldust shirt. Next up, we have Jeff Hardy shirt. Next up, we have The Undertaker shirt. Next up, we have another The Undertaker shirt. Next up, we have Brock Lesnar shirt. Next up, we have Macho Man Randy Savage shirt. Next up, we have The Rock shirt. Next up, we have Brock Lesnar shirt. Next up, we have another Brock Lesnar shirt. Next up, we have Hulk Hogan shirt. Next up, we have another Hulk Hogan shirt. Next up, we have Jeff Hardy shirt. Next up, we have D-Generation X shirt. Next up, we have Road Dogg DX shirt. Next up, we have D-Generation X shirt. Next up, we have another D-Generation X shirt. And another D-Generation X shirt. Next up, we have Eddie Guerrero shirt. Next up, we have Ryback shirt. Next up, we have Wade Barrett shirt. Next up, we have Big Cass shirt. Next up, we have Enzo Amore shirt. Next up, we have Cody Rhodes shirt. Next up, we have Dolph Ziggler shirt. Next up, we have AJ Styles shirt. Next up, we have Brock Lesnar shirt. Next up, we have Hulk Hogan shirt. Next up, we have Finn Balor shirt. Next up, we have CM Punk shirt. Next up, we have Scotty 2 Hotty Polo shirt. Next up, we have Petey Williams Polo shirt. Next up, we have Y2J Chris Jericho Polo shirt. Next up, we have Seth Rollins Vest Jacket. Next up we have another Seth Rollins Vest Jacket. Next up we have Roman Reigns The Shield Vest Jacket. Next up we have Bobby Lashley Vest. Next up we have Psycho Sid Jacket Vest. Next up we have AJ Styles Jacket Vest. Next up we have another AJ Styles Jacket Vest. Next up we have Shinsuke Nakamura Jacket Vest. Next up we have Razor Ramon Vest. Next up we have Scott Hall Vest. Next up we have another Scott Hall Vest. Next up we have Stone Cold Steve Austin Vest. Next up we have Kevin Nash Vest. Next up we have DDP Diamond Dallas Page Vest. Next up we have Dolph Ziggler Vest. Next up we have Ryback Vest. Next up we have Dolph Ziggler Vest. Next up we have Pete Dunne Jacket Vest. Next up we have Bray Wyatt Jacket Vest. Next up we have Tyler Breeze Jacket Vest. Next up we have R-Truth Vest Jacket. Next up we have Jey Uso Vest Jacket. Next up we have Enzo Amore Vest Jacket. Next up we have Kurt Hawkins Vest Jacket. Next up we have Xavier Woods Vest. Next up we have Kofi Kingston Jacket Vest. Next up we have Fandango Vest. Next up we have Mick Foley Vest. Next up we have Cody Rhodes Jacket Vest. Next up we have AJ Styles Jacket Vest. Next up we have another AJ Styles Jacket Vest. Another AJ Styles Jacket Vest. Next up we have Jeff Hardy Jacket Vest. Next up we have AJ Styles Jacket Vest. Next up we have Tyson Kidd Jacket Vest. Next up we have Dean Ambrose Jacket Vest. Next up we have John Moxley Jacket Vest. Next up we have Randy Orton Jacket Vest. Next up we have another Randy Orton Jacket Vest. Next up we have The Game Triple H Jacket Vest. Next up we have The Undertaker Vest. Next up we have Aleister Black Jacket Vest. Next up we have Baron Corbin Jacket Vest. Next up we have Finn Balor Jacket. Next up we have the Brian Kendrick Jacket. Next up we have Bret the Hitman Hart Jacket. Next up we have Y2J Chris Jericho Jacket. Next up we have another Chris Jericho Jacket. Ito glow in the dark to. Alright. Next up we have Lita Accessory. Next up we have Natalya Vest. Next up we have Sasha Banks Jacket. Next up we have Bray Wyatt Apron. Next up we have Roddy Piper Kilt. Next up we have Umaga Accessory. Next up we have Rikishi Accessory. Next up we have HBK Shawn Michael Accessory. Next up we have another Shawn Michael Accessory. Next up we have Austin Aries Cape. Next up we have Gregory Helms coat. Next up we have Luke Gallows coat. Next up we have Sin Cara coat. Next up we have Woken Matt Hardy coat. Next up we have Big E coat. Next up we have The Miz coat. Next up we have another The Miz coat. Next up we have another The Miz coat. Next up we have Drew McIntyre coat. Next up we have Ricochet coat. Next up we have William Regal robe. Next up we have Sting coat. Next up we have another Sting coat. Next up we have The Undertaker coat. Next up we have Edge coat. Next up we have another Edge coat. Next up we have The Undertaker coat. Next up we have another The Undertaker coat. Next up we have King Booker accessories. So, ito yung crown, ito yung scepter, then ito yung cape. Ayan. Alright. Next up we have Hunter Hearst Helmsley accessory. Ayan. Next up we have another Triple H accessory. Ayan. Alright. Next up we have another Triple H accessory. Ayan. Alright. Next up we have another Triple H accessory. Ayan. Terminator. Like it did. Alright. Next up we have Lord Tensai accessory. Ayan. Then ito yung robe. Alright. Bali may mga pahabolan tayo dito. Next up we have George St. Pierre na bandana. Next up we have Sasha Banks Boss necklace. Next up we have Scott Hall Jax Deluxe shirt. Medyo sticky na siya kaya nilagay ko lang sa plastic. Next up we have Ronda Rousey Jacket Vest. Ayan. Next up we have Roman Reigns The Shield Vest Jacket. Next up we have another Roman Reigns Vest Jacket. Next up we have another Roman Reigns Vest Jacket. Next up we have Ronda Rousey Kilt. Next up we have Raven Skirt. Next up we have Tommaso Ciampa na pants. Next up we have Batman Black Cape. Ayan, pwede siya kay Rey Mysterio or kung kanino man. Next up we have another Batman Cape. Ayan. Fit na fit kay Rey Mysterio yan. Next up we have Superman Cape. Ayan. Alright. Inalis ko muna yung iba mga ka-Gentle Ka-WWE kasi sobrang punong-puno na tayo. Alright. Next up we have The Fiend Bray Wyatt stand. Ayan. Dito nilalagay si Bray. Alright. Next up we have WWF stand. Yan. Mga rare na yan na stand. Next up we have another WWF stand. Yan. Alright. Next up, we have another WWF stand. Yan, iba yung kulay niya compared dito sa regular. Next up, we have King of the Ring stand platform. Ayan, rare na talaga, di ba? Next up, we have another stand. Ayan, iba pang stand natin. Yan. Then, meron nilalagay dyan. Ito. Ayan, we have Mr. Perfect, John Cena, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, The Hurricane, The Miz, MVP, Mike Knox. Yan. Sample natin, no? Saan siya ilalagay? Bali, dito niya siya ilalagay. Yan. Tapos, tatayo nyo dito yung figure yan. Diba? Tayo na rin natin to. Ayan. Diba? Ang ganda. Lalo na pag may figure. You know? Alright. Next up, we have WrestleMania 27 stand platform. Ayan. Then, ito pa ibang stand. Kung naabutan nyo to. Ayan, yung pinagduduktong-duktong. Tapos may nilalagay dyan. Pakita ko lang sa inyo. Ito. Ayan. Ayan. Kumbaga, ito yung background. Ayan. Dami. Halos di ko rin nagamit ito mga to eh. Pero sana may paggamitan tayo nito. Diba? Ayan pa. Ayan si Neville, Scotty 2 Hotty, Matt Hardy, Jeff Hardy, Carl Anderson, Luke Gallows, AJ Styles, Bray Wyatt, Charlotte Flair, Kurt Angle, Elias, Triple H, Big Cass, The Undertaker. Ayan. Tapos lagay natin, mamili lang tayo dito. Bali ganyan yung itsura niya mga ka-Gentle Ka-WWE pagka nailagay nyo na. Tapos dito nyo ilalagay yung mga figures nyo. Alright, next up we have Entrance Great Stand Platform. Ayan, kay Roddy Piper to. Ito yung early days na release nila, ganyan yung itsura. Then next up we have Entrance Great Stand Platform Bobby Roode, no? Ito na yung latest na release nila. Ayan, yung comparison. Alright. Next up we have another Entrance Great Platform, Jeff Hardy. Next up, we have another Entrance Great Platform, Goldberg. Ayan. Alright. Next up, we have cardboard crowd sign accessories. Ito kay Kofi Kingston. Then ito kay Stephanie McMahon. Then ito yung Festival of Friendship, no? Chris Jericho and Kevin Owens. Alright. Next up, we have ring accessory. Ayan, kung gusto mo mag-top rope yung action figure mo, kakabit mo lang yan. Alright? Inalis ko lang ulit yung mga tapos natin para medyo maluwag tayo. Next up, we have plant. Ayan. Next up, we have vault. Ayan, na-open siya. Ayan. Pwede nyo rin lagyan ng kahit anong item dyan sa taas. Alright. Next up, we have mask protector. Ayan. Pang showcase yan ng mask. Ilalagay nyo lang sa loob. Na-open yan. Alright. Next up, we have fire extinguisher. Ayan. Next up, we have dumbbells. Ayan. Next up, we have 200 pounds weight. Next up, we have barbell. Ayan. Ang laki niya. Next up, we have gym chair. Ayan. Breakable siya. Next up, we have bucket. Ayan. Dalawang klase ng bucket. Na-open to. Alright. Next up, we have trash can. Itong dalawang to sa Jakks Pacific. Ito sa Mattel. Alright. Next up, we have barrels. Bale, ito nag-explode to. May makikita kayong fire effect nito sa loob pagka nag-explode. Testingin natin. Ito, dito muna to. Ayan. Ready? 3, 2, 1... Kaboom! Ayan, yung fire effect stick, di ba? Alright. Next up, we have another barrel. Pero ito, na-open to. Ayan. Alright. Next up, we have WWF table. Ayan. Alright. Ito kay Elias to. Next up, we have cocktail table. Ayan. Next up, we have belt showcase stand table. Next up, we have podium. Ayan. Next up, we have storage unit. Ayan. Color red. Next up, we have another storage unit. Color blue naman to. Alright. Next up, we have abyss chain. Next up, we have Goldberg chain. Next up, we have JBL Texas Bull Rope. Next up, we have umbrella. Na-open yan. Ayan. Pa isa. You know. Alright. Next up, we have security guard stick. Next up, we have Kurt Hawkins stick. Next up, we have metal stick. Next up, we have Kendo Stick. Ito sa Jakks Pacific, ito sa Mattel. Alright. Next up, we have crutch. Next up, we have Sting Bat. Next up, we have Triple H Sledgehammer. Next up, we have Mick Foley Barbie. Ayan. Next up, we have Seth Rollins Torch. Next up, we have handcuffs. Ayan. Next up, we have screwdriver. Next up, we have wrench. Ayan. Next up, we have lead pipe. Next up, we have the Undertaker shovel. Ayan. Alright. Grabe, astig na mga weapons natin. Talagang pang extreme hardcore na eh. Next up, we have crowbar. Ayan, sakit nito. Next up, we have grass scissor. Ayan o. Next up, we have axe. Grabe, pang horror na. Next up, we have chainsaw. Ayan, ang masakit talaga pag tumama yan. Diba? Alright. Next up, we have cookie sheet. Grabe, bakat pa yung mukha. Next up, we have sail piece. Next up, we have barbed wire table. Look at that. Next up, we have tech deck skateboard. Ayan. Next up, we have tire. Next up, we have another tire. Next up, we have traffic cone. Next up, we have speed limit 10 sign. Next up, we have do not enter sign. Next up, we have stop sign and dead end sign. Next up, we have chokeslam highway street. Next up, we have extremist boulevard street. Next up, we have raw roulette. Closer look. Look at that. Naalala nyo pa ba to? Comment down below. Stick nito. Alright. Next up, we have paint stand. Next up, we have Festival of Friendship accessory. Ang laki nito. Ayun, no? Next up, we have raw signage. Closer look. Ayan, Stig. Ang laki rin. Next up, we have backstage pop-up accessory. Pan-design yan. Alright. Next up, we have ring accessory. Look at that. Alright. Next up, we have brick block. Stig. Next up, we have wooden pallet. Look at it. Alright. Next up, we have wooden box pallet. Ayan, na-open siya. Nasasara din. Alright. Next up, we have table cart. Ayan. Stig. Next up, we have shopping cart. Ayan, metal. Next up, we have wheel barrel. Ayan. Then, meron mga skull. Ayan. Ayan. Ayan pa. Then, meron ding cemetery headstone. Ayan. Tsaka ito pa. cemetery headstone. Rest in peace. Alright. Next up, we have WWF Trash Bin and Broom. Ayan, rare na. Next up, we have Dumpster Garbage. Grabe, sobrang laki. Oh. Kasyang-kasya isang figure nyo dyan. Ayan, na-open din. Yan. Alright. Next up, we have Wheelchair. Ayan. Alright. Next up, we have Stretcher made by Jakks Pacific. Next up, we have another Stretcher made by Mattel. Ayan, sunod-sunod na yan. Next up, we have another Stretcher. Ayan. Next up, we have another Stretcher. Ayan. Next up, we have another last Stretcher. Ito yung pinakamalupit ko. Deluxe Stretcher. Ayan, oh. Look at that. Stick, diba? Ayan. Ayan. Tapos aangat pa yan. Ito yung pinakamalupit na stretcher ko. Pag nilagay mo dito yung action figure mo, talagang safe na safe, diba? Alright. Next up, we have Classic Barricade. Ayan. Next up, we have another Barricade. Ito yung mas latest. Ayan. Alright. Next up, we have Scaffoldings. Ayan, no? Yung mga pang-design sa stage. Alright. Next up, puro steel chair to lahat. We have WCW NWO Steel Chair. Another steel chair. Ayan. Another steel chair. Another steel chair. Steel chair. Ayan. Another steel chair. Ayan. Then we have WrestleMania 31 steel chair. Look at it. Alright. Next up, we have Commentator's chair. Ayan, nabibed siya ng ganyan. Then 360 rotation natin. Ayan. Alright. Next up natin, puro tables. We have Jakks Pacific Breakaway Tables. Alright. Next up, we have Ultimate Breakaway Table. Ayan. Alright. Next up, we have Mattel Breakaway Tables. Ayan. Next up natin, puro ladders. We have a small ladder. Ayan. Next up, we have another small ladder. Ayan, ganyan siya kalaki. Next up, we have venti ladder. Ayan. Next up, we have another venti ladder. Nabi-break yan. Grabe, taas niyan. Next up, we have the ultimate ladder. Ayan, nabi-break yan. Pinaka malaki sa lahat. Grabe, sobrang taas niyan pagka nilagay niyo yung figure nyo rito. Sobra. Oh my. Next up natin, puro steel steps. Yan. Alright. Next up, we have another steel steps. Ito hindi nare-remove to. Ayan. Next up, we have the ultimate steel steps. Yan. Ito kasi nare-remove yan. Ibabalik din siya. Kaya ultimate siya, di ba? Alright. Next up, we have the last but not the least, the main event. We have the breakable commentators announcers table. Ayan. Then nare-remove yan. Then 360 rotation natin. Ayan, nakikita nyo yung monitor. Ayan, nare-remove siya. Ayan yung tsura niya. Ito pa. Ayan. Alright. Next up, we have another breakable commentators announcers table. Ayan yung new logo ng WWE. Another 360 rotation. Ayan. Alright. Next up, we have Ringside Collectibles, Breakable Commentators, Announcers Table. Ayan, di ko na binuo kasi medyo mahirap siyang baklasin. Ayan. Alright. Next up, we have the last Breakable Commentators, Announcers Table, WrestleMania 32. Ayan, di ko na rin binuo. Kasi ganun lang din naman yung itsura niya. Alright. And that's it for today's video mga ka-Gentle Ka-WWE. Sana nag-enjoy ka and nagustuhan mo yung pag-show up ko. Kung umabot ka muli hanggang dito sa dulo, gusto ko lang sabihin sa'yo na thank you super very much sa suporta, sa pagdood. Abangan nyo pa yung mga upcoming vlogs natin. Please don't skip ads, send super chat, send super stickers, send super thanks. And syempre, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. Lagi nyong tatanda pa sa mga Gentle KEBOY ay tamaheraw. Peace. Suck it.